Welcome to the human limit. Civilization is a fragile thing. We like to think it is built on sturdy foundations, on laws, on religions, and the shared belief that every life is sacred. But the truth is that civilization is a luxury of the dry land. It requires a stable floor beneath your feet and a predictable sun above your head. When you leave the coast, when the last lighthouse fades into the mist, and there is nothing beneath you but 4 miles of crushing black water, the rules change. The ocean does not care about your morals. It does not recognize your rank, your bank account, or the family waiting for you back home. The ocean only understands physics. It understands displacement. It understands buoyancy. And sometimes the ocean demands a tally, a trade, one life for another. Tonight we are going into the heart of the North Atlantic. It is midwinter, 1954. The cargo ship was the SS Ventress. It was a rusted hull carrying iron ore, cutting through waves the size of apartment buildings. At 2:14 in the morning, the hull groaned one last time and simply gave up. Imagine the sound, not just the alarms, because those are expected. Imagine the sound of 10,000 tons of steel being twisted like a soda can, the scream of rivets popping under the pressure, and the water, not a splash but a roar, a cold, violent intrusion that smells of diesel fuel and ancient salt. In the chaos, amidst the freezing spray and the pitch-black night, one lifeboat was launched. Boat number 4. It was designed for 12 men. 12. That was the capacity etched into the brass plate near the tiller. But when the Ventress finally slipped beneath the waves, vanishing into the abyss with a sound like a dying god, 15 men were clinging to that boat. 15 men in a space meant for 12, in a sea that was already claiming its due. What follows is the confession of Elias Thorne. He was the first officer, the man left in charge of Boat 4. He never spoke about this in court. He never told his wife. He wrote it down in a journal weeks before he took his own life in a motel room in Maine. In that journal, Thorne described the darkness. He wrote that the night was not black, because black is too soft a word. It was a void. It was as if the universe had been extinguished, leaving only 15 men and the sound of the water. His hands did not feel like his anymore. They were blocks of ice fused to the wood of the oars. They had pulled 15 souls from the oil-slicked swells, but he could feel the boat beneath them. She was heavy. She was not dancing on the waves anymore. She was wallowing. Every time a swell passed, the gunwales dipped. A quarter-inch of the Atlantic would pour over the side, then another. They were bailing with their boots and with their cupped hands, but the math was against them. They were 3,000 pounds of meat in a vessel designed for 2,000, and the cold was the real executioner. It starts in the fingers, then it crawls up the arms, searching for the heart. Thorne knew. He looked at the men around him. He saw the panic in their eyes, the white-rimmed stares of men who realized they had survived the sinking, only to be invited to a slow, freezing funeral. The Ventress was gone. No distress signal had been confirmed. They were hundreds of miles from the shipping lanes, and the boat was sinking. Not in an hour, not in 10 minutes. Now. With every breath, the lifeboat sat a fraction of a millimeter lower. Thorne had to make a choice that would haunt every second of the rest of his life. He did not have a committee. He did not have a judge. He only had the cold and the sinking wood. He had to ask himself how one chooses who deserves to breathe. In his writing, Thorne admitted he looked at his crew. These were men he had shared coffee with, men whose children's names he knew. He saw Miller. Miller was only 21, a boy from Ohio. His legs had been crushed when the davit snapped during the launch. He was delirious, moaning for his mother, his blood mixing with the salt water in the bottom of the boat. He was taking up the space of a man who could row, a man who could fight the ocean. Then there was Henderson. He was the oldest of them. He had been in the engine room when the boiler blew. His lungs were seared. Every breath he took sounded like sandpaper on glass. He was dying, but he just had not realized it yet. And then there was the cook, a man they called Sully. Sully was catatonic. He was just staring at his own blue hands, refusing to bail, refusing to move, refusing to acknowledge the world. He was dead weight. Thorne looked at the water. It was an inch from the edge. He looked at the 9 men who were still bailing, their faces masks of raw animal terror. He knew that if he did nothing, the next large wave would swamp them. They would all be in the water. In 30 seconds, their heart rates would spike. In 2 minutes, their muscles would seize. In 5 minutes, 15 bodies would be floating face down in the dark. He was the first officer. The law of the sea says the master is responsible for the safety of the crew. But the law of the sea does not tell you how to murder your brothers to save the rest. Thorn did not ask for volunteers. He knew no one would raise their hand. In that moment, the human limit is not about strength. It is about the terrifying realization that you are capable of anything when the void is staring back at you. The execution began at 3:30 in the morning. Thorn stood up. The lifeboat rocked violently. The men screamed, thinking they were capsizing. Thorn pulled his service flare gun. He did not use it to kill, but he held it because it was the only symbol of authority left in the world. He called out Miller's name. Thorn reached down. Miller was too weak to fight. He was a bag of broken bones and wet wool. Thorn grabbed him by the life vest. The other survivors did not help, but they did not stop him either. They shrank back. They made a hole in the geography of the boat. They gave Thorn the space to be a monster. Miller did not even scream, not at first. He just looked at Thorn with eyes that had already accepted the end. Thorn heaved him over the side. The boy hit the water with a dull splash. The lifeboat rose an inch. 1 inch of life, bought with 1 human soul. But it was not enough. The boat was still sluggish. The Atlantic was still hungry. Thorn turned his gaze to Henderson. Henderson saw him coming. He tried to speak, but his throat was a ruin of ash and salt. He just shook his head. He clutched the side of the boat with a strength Thorn did not know an old man possessed. Thorn had to pry his fingers off one by one. In his journal, he said he could still hear the sound of those fingernails scraping against the wood. It sounded like a cat at a door. Thorn looked at the others. He shouted at them to help him. He told them they were all going to die if they did not help. They just stared at their boots. They were already dead inside. He pushed him. Henderson did not sink immediately. He floated there, his white hair fanning out in the oil. He did not swim away. He just stayed there, bobbing against the side of the boat, looking at the men who had just discarded him. Thorn had to use an oar to push him into the dark. He pushed his friend away like he was a piece of driftwood. And then there was Sully, the cook. Sully was the largest man on the ship. Pushing him was not going to be easy, and by now the adrenaline in the boat had turned into something else, a fever. The remaining survivors realized what was happening. They realized that their lives were being paid for in blood. Thorn walked toward Sully, but Sully woke up. The catatonia snapped. He saw Miller was gone. He saw Henderson was gone. He saw Thorn standing over him with the eyes of a shark. They fought. In that tiny rocking boat, surrounded by 1,000 miles of nothing, 2 men wrestled for the right to exist. It was a mess of elbows and teeth. The boat nearly capsized 3 times. The water poured in. The other survivors finally moved, but not to help Thorn. They moved to hold the other side of the boat so they would not all flip into the grave. Finally, Thorn got a grip on Sully's throat. He pressed his thumb into the windpipe. He used the weight of his own guilt to shove the man backward. Sully went over the side, but he did not let go. He grabbed the rope railing. This is the part that Thorn wrote about on the last page of his journal, the part that kept him awake until the day he died. Sully did not curse him. He did not beg. He looked up at Thorn, his face inches from the freezing water, and he looked at the boat. Then he looked at Thorn, and he said, "Don't let them forget I was here, Elias. Tell my girl I tried." And then he just let go. He did not wait for Thorn to push him. He chose to slip into the dark so the boat would stop rocking. He gave Thorn the gift of a clean conscience, and Thorn wrote that it was the most cruel thing anyone had ever done to him. At 4:15 in the morning, the lifeboat sat 3 inches higher in the water. The bailing stopped. The 12 remaining men sat in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, shivering in a silence so heavy it felt like it would crack the world. No one spoke. No one looked at Thorn. They were alive. The math had worked. 15 minus 3 equals life. The rescue ship, a Norwegian tanker, found them at dawn. The sun crawled over the horizon, a cold, pale disk that offered no warmth, only the clarity to see what they had become. When the sailors on the tanker looked down into Boat 4, they saw 12 ghosts. They saw men who looked like they had been hollowed out from the inside. Thorn was the last one up the ladder. He refused to let go of the tiller until every other man was safe. There was an inquiry, of course. There always is. The Maritime Board in London, the insurance lawyers, they all wanted to know what happened. They asked about the capacity. They asked about the missing men. The 12 survivors told the same story. Miller, Henderson, and Sully had been swept away by a rogue wave during the launch. A tragic accident. An act of God. They lied. All of them. They were co-conspirators in a silent pact of survival. They knew that if they told the truth, they would have to admit that their lives were built on the bodies of their friends. They chose to live with the lie rather than die with the truth. Elias Thorne was never charged with a crime. He was even given a commendation for his leadership under pressure. He spent the next 20 years working at a shipyard, never going back to sea. He became a man of few words, a man who stayed away from the water. But the sea does not forget, and the human mind is not designed to hold that kind of weight. In his final entry, Thorne wrote that the lawyers call it the law of necessity. The priests call it a sin of survival. But he knew what it was. It was a murder in slow motion. He wrote that he could still feel Sully's hand on the rope. He could still feel the boat rising as he let go. Every time he took a breath, he felt like he was stealing it from him. We like to judge Elias Thorne from the safety of our warm rooms, with our coffee and our stable floors. We like to say we would have stayed. We like to say we would have gone into the water ourselves. But until you are in that boat, until you feel the cold stealing your heart and the water licking at your ankles, you do not know who you are. Was it a crime? Or was it the only act of mercy available in a world without light? If you were one of the 12, would you have spoken up? Or would you have sat in the dark, bailing the water, and thanked God it was not you? The math is simple. The cost is infinite. The sound of the ocean is a haunting thing when you realize it is the largest graveyard on earth. For Thorne, the sound of a faucet dripping or the rain hitting the roof was enough to bring back the smell of the diesel and the sight of Henderson's white hair. He spent his final years in a small town in Maine, as far from the docks as he could get. But the Atlantic is never really far away. It is in the air. It is in the salt on the skin. He lived in a state of perpetual debt, a debt he knew he could never pay back. He once told a neighbor that some people are saved so they can live, and others are saved so they can testify. But Thorne could not testify. He was trapped by the very men he saved. If he told the truth, he would destroy the lives of the 11 other men who had gone back to their families, to their wives, and to their children. He carried their secret like a stone in his pocket, growing heavier with every passing year. The human limit is not a fixed point. It moves. It shifts based on how much air is left in the room or how much water is in the boat. We want to believe in heroes who sacrifice themselves, and those people do exist. But we also have to acknowledge the survivors, the ones who do the unthinkable so that the species continues. On that night in 1954, Elias Thorne was not a hero, and he was not a villain. He was a man caught in the cold gears of a mechanical universe. He was a man who looked at a brass plate that said 12 and a reality that said 15, and he chose the only path that did not end in total silence. When they found his body in that motel room, the journal was sitting on the nightstand, open to the first page. There was no suicide note, just the ledger of a man who had finally finished his calculations. He had spent 20 years trying to find a way to make the numbers balance, to find a way where Miller and Henderson and Sully did not have to die for him to live. But the math of the sea is absolute. It does not accept apologies. It does not accept regret. It only accepts the trade. As you go about your week, sitting in the comfort of your home, listen to the silence. Listen to the steady floor beneath you. And remember boat number 4. Remember that the thin line between a civilized man and a monster is often just 3 inches of displacement in a cold, dark sea. We all hope we would be the one to let go. We all hope we would be Sully, giving the gift of life with a final, quiet word. But the truth is, most of us are just the ones sitting in the circle, bailing the water, staring at our boots, and waiting for the sun to rise over a world that will never be the same again. Thank you for joining us on The Human Limit. May you never have to learn where your limit truly lies. Think about the men who stayed in the boat. For the rest of their lives, every time they saw a young man Miller's age, or an old man with Henderson's laugh, or tasted a meal like the one Sully used to cook, they were reminded of the price of their pulse. Some of them turned to the bottle. Some of them became overly religious, trying to bargain with a god they felt they had betrayed. But all of them carried the lifeboat with them. It was a phantom vessel, invisible to everyone else, but always there, lurking in the corners of their living rooms. They were 12 men bound by a crime of necessity, a brotherhood of shadows. Thorne's journal ended with a final reflection on the nature of mercy. He wrote that perhaps the greatest mercy was not being the one who lived, but being the one who went into the dark. Because the ones who went into the dark were finished with the struggle. They were finished with the cold. They were finished with the impossible choices. But for the ones who stayed, the struggle was just beginning. They had to live with the memory of the fingernails on the wood. They had to live with the sight of the white hair in the oil. They had to live with the weight of the breaths they took, knowing they were stolen. The sea keeps its secrets, but it also shares them with those who listen. If you stand on the shore of the North Atlantic on a cold winter night, and you listen to the roar of the waves against the rocks, you might hear it. You might hear the scream of the steel. You might hear the splash of the water. And if you listen very closely, you might hear a voice in the wind, a voice saying, "Don't let them forget I was here." We haven't forgotten, Sully. We haven't forgotten the cost of the boat. In the end, Elias Thorne didn't die from a lack of air or a lack of light. He died from the weight of the displacement. He died because he finally reached the human limit, the point where the soul can no longer carry what the body had to do to survive. He joined his crew in the only way he knew how, leaving behind a yellowed ledger and a question that will never have a right answer. We like to think we are different. We like to think we are better. But the ocean is still there, waiting, cold and indifferent, ready to remind us that when the lights go out and the floor disappears, we are all just souls in a boat, trying to stay afloat in a universe that doesn't care if we sink or swim. Think about the silence that followed the last splash. That is the part Thorne struggled to describe. He said it was a silence that felt like it had weight, like it was a physical presence in the boat. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of an absolute judgment. The 9 men who were left, they didn't look at Thorne, not because they were angry, but because they were ashamed. They were ashamed of their own relief. They were ashamed of the way their hearts beat a little faster and a little steadier as the boat rose in the water. They were ashamed that they wanted to live so badly that they were willing to let Thorne be the murderer for them. That is the true human limit. It isn't just what we are willing to do to survive. It is what we are willing to let others do on our behalf. We delegate our darkness. We let our leaders, our soldiers, our officers do the dirty work so we can keep our hands clean. But in that lifeboat, there was no distance. There was no delegation. They all felt the shift in the wood. They all felt the air get a little easier to breathe. They were all holding the oar that pushed the others away. Elias Thorne took the blame because that was his job. He was the officer. He was the one who had to make the entry in the log. But the log was empty. The ocean had washed away the ink. All that was left was the memory of the cold. Thorne wrote that he spent the rest of his life trying to get warm. He would sit by the fire in his house in Maine, the flames roaring, the heat blistering his skin, but he could still feel the North Atlantic in his marrow. He could still feel the winter of 1954 in his blood. He wrote that the ocean is a mirror. When you look into it, you don't see the water, you see yourself. You see the parts of yourself you try to hide in the daylight. You see the animal that lives inside the suit and the tie. You see the man who would push his brother into the dark to see the dawn. And once you see that man, you can never unsee him. He follows you. He sits at your table. He sleeps in your bed. He is the one who finally closes your eyes. When the Norwegian tanker arrived, the sailors thought they were rescuing 12 heroes who had survived the impossible. They gave them blankets. They gave them hot soup. They told them they were lucky. But the men of Boat 4 didn't feel lucky. They felt like they had been caught. They felt like they were being brought back to a world they no longer belonged to. They had crossed the human limit, and once you cross it, there is no going back. You are a citizen of a different country now, a country of shadows and salt. Thorne's confession is a map of that country. It is a guide to the places we hope we never have to go. It is a reminder that the cost of life is often paid in coins we don't want to handle. As the bulb flickers out and the darkness takes this room, remember Elias Thorne. Remember Boat 4. And remember that the ocean is always there, measuring the displacement, waiting for the next trade. The math is simple. The cost is infinite. Sleep well, if you can, knowing that the floor beneath you is solid, for now. But never forget how quickly it can turn to water. The human limit is closer than you think. It is just one wave away. It is just one choice away. And in the dark, everyone's hands look the same. Everyone's blood is the same color in the oil. We are all 15, and the boat only holds 12. Who are you in the dark? Are you the one who pushes, the one who is pushed, or the one who stays silent and watches the water rise? The ocean already knows the answer. One day, you might too. Until then, we stay on the dry land, clinging to our laws and our morals, and we pray the storm never comes for us. Because the storm doesn't care about your prayers. It only cares about the math. And the math never lies. Thank you for listening to The Human Limit. Until next time, keep the light on. You never know when the darkness will start to rise. You never know when the boat will start to sink. And when it does, remember the fingernails on the wood. Remember the white hair in the oil. Remember Sully. Because if we forget them, the displacement was for nothing. If we forget them, then we are the ones who are truly lost at sea. Good night.